As you said, we have some technique. Okay, now I'm told recording is in progress. We had some technical problems that we still have, so I will need to ask for the next slide as in the old days. I can't change them myself. Okay. Now, I read, is this the second slide?
Yes.
I decided to read the 5 most used textbooks in Denmark for students of medicine, psychology, and psychiatry, because there is so much wrong with psychiatry. I described what is wrong with the textbooks in my own textbook, because this is where the indoctrination starts. That's when students learn something at university. I uncovered a litany of misleading and, no, it's too quickly, please go back. I uncovered a litany of misleading and erroneous statements in these textbooks. I also described fraud and serious manipulations with the data in often cited research in the textbooks. Next slide. So this is my own textbook, which is available on the website of the Institute for Scientific Freedom. So my conclusion is that psychiatric textbooks are totally unreliable, and much of what is claimed amounts to scientific dishonesty. And of course, Denmark is no exception. This is the same all over the world, because psychiatry has the same ideas in all countries. A book review came out just a few days ago, and I uploaded it on my website, as you can see here. Next slide. The most horrible of the erroneous claims in the textbooks are these ones. Mental health disorders have biological causes. They are genetic. They can be detected in a brain scan. They are caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain. Psychiatric diagnoses are reliable. They are very unreliable, but the research that has shown this is not easy to find. Psychiatric drugs and electroshocks are beneficial. No, they are actually harmful. Next slide. So let's have a closer look at depression. Depression pills were uncritically recommended in the textbooks, even though they have no clinically relevant effects. This has been shown in several meta-analyses. They cause sexual disturbances in half of those treated, which are pronounced in half of them, and can become permanent. They double the risk of suicide, both in children and adults, whereas psychotherapy halves this risk. And the patients want psychotherapy, but this is not what they get. Next slide. So a survey from 96 of 2003 lay people in the UK showed that 6 times as many people thought that people with depression should be offered counseling as those who thought they should be offered pills. And most people regarded the pills as addictive, which is a fact, but it is firmly denied by leading psychiatrists even today. A 2002 survey of US child and adolescent psychiatrists showed that 10 times as many of their patients were treated with psychiatric drugs as those that received psychotherapy only. This is very, very bad. We are talking about children. Some children commit suicide because of these drugs, and they are absolutely not helpful for them. This is a disaster when we use pills that kill some of our children. and that don't work. In Sweden, the National Board of Health recommends all adults with mild to moderately severe depression to be treated by psychotherapy, but only 1% get it. Next slide. And psychotherapy is clearly better, and it is even cheaper than pills, even though you often hear the argument that we cannot afford psychotherapy. This is totally wrong, because the pills increase the number of people that come on disability pension, and this is incredibly expensive for society. Studies with long-term follow-up show that psychotherapy for depression has an enduring effect that outperforms pills, which should come as no surprise. The open dialogue principle that was invented in Finland for acute psychosis is also very effective. It can be considered a type of psychotherapy. So here are 19-year results comparing the open dialogue approach with the standard Finnish approach. 19% versus 94% had more than 30 hospital days. Disability allowances at some point occurred for 42% versus 79%. Psychosis drugs at onset of psychosis were used by 20% versus 70%. And at some point in time during 19 years, by 55% versus 97%. So the patient fared tremendously better by a human approach rather than pills. This was not a randomized trial, but the patients were comparable, and the differences were so huge that it would be unethical to dismiss them. There are other data that show that psychotherapy works. Also, randomized trials have shown that psychotherapy works for psychosis and schizophrenia. Next slide, please. I have studied psychiatry for 15 years and have come to the conclusion that this is the weirdest business on earth. If it had not been a monopoly, but an enterprise with true competitors, it would have gone bankrupt decades ago, because the customers don't get what they want and they get harmed by psychiatry. So it's a perverse trade. It doesn't help the patients as they want to be helped, but helps itself while it kills millions of people and incapacitates permanently many more. Using randomized trials and the best comparative cohort studies I could find, I have come to the conclusion that psychiatric drugs might be the third leading cause of death after heart disease and cancer. Perhaps it's only the fourth or the fifth leading cause of death, but it's the fact that psychiatric drugs kill millions of people. And not only psychosis drugs, but also drugs against depression and anti-epileptic drugs and other psychiatric drugs. Next slide. So what do the brain scans tell us? No psychiatric disorder has ever been verified on a brain scan, despite claims to the contrary. Results from brain scan studies took a lot of space in the textbooks, even though they are highly unreliable. There is an almost endless way in which scans can be analyzed. When the editor-in-chief of Molecular Brain requested to see the raw data, in 41 of 180 manuscripts he had handled, the authors withdrew 21 manuscripts. And we started only with 41, that's half of them. And he rejected a further 19 because of insufficient raw data, which suggested that the raw data might not exist. Thus, only one of 41 papers passed his reasonable test. The only thing brain scans have shown with certainty is that psychosis drugs shrink the brain, but this result was downplayed or outright denied in the textbooks. Next slide. And what about genetics? That's the same sad story. The textbooks are full of claims that psychiatric disorders are hereditary. Why do they write so much about this? Because you cannot change your genes, and they're writing textbooks for students. So it makes absolutely no sense. This is simply to bolster the psychiatric guilt that they do this. These claims refer to twin studies, which are highly unreliable. In such studies, hereditary and environmental factors cannot be separated, not even when twins have been adopted and grow up in another family. This has been shown in several studies that the equal environment assumption is simply not tenable. But now we have real genetic studies, and the textbooks spoke of breakthroughs in using genome-wide association studies, but there are none. For schizophrenia and similar disorders, each of several hundred genes identified contribute very little, and the many loci explain only about 5% of the so-called heritability. So it is again the emperor's new clothes. For other diagnoses, it's the same. Next slide, please. So I found a lot of scientific dishonesty in the textbooks, and here are some examples. When the results from randomized trials did not please the authors, they referred to substandard research instead, which was typically grossly flawed observational studies or their own clinical experience. This I call the UFO trick, and it is about not losing power and prestige and be forced to admit that you were wrong. If you use a fuzzy photo to prove you have seen a UFO, when a photo taken with a strong telephoto lens has shown that the object is an airplane or a bird, you're a cheat. So when genetic studies, for example, have come up empty-handed, there is no reason to pollute textbooks with fuzzy articles about twin studies and no reason to read about them. Next slide. Several textbooks claimed that psychosis drugs decrease mortality, even though the randomized trials show that they double mortality pretty quickly, already after only 10 weeks of treatment. Depression pills were claimed to increase suicidal thoughts, which is correct, and only in the beginning of treatment. The truth is that they not only increase thoughts, they double actual suicides, which can happen at any time, not only in the beginning of treatment, and it happens particularly when the dose goes up or down. Electroshocks were claimed to be life-saving. This has never been documented, but it has been documented that they kill about 1 in 1,000, so it's the opposite. Next slide. It was my clear impression that the more unlikely the claims were in the textbooks, the more likely it was that there were no references. And my general impression was that the psychiatric drugs, that's the impression the authors wanted to give their students, that the drugs improve the lives of patients substantially and also their longevity. Sorry, but this is plain bullshit. It is not true. It is the opposite. The use of psychiatric drugs is closely related to the rate of disability pensions in all countries where this relationship has been examined. This should surprise no one if you're not a psychiatrist. defending your specialty. So, as I said before, based on the most reliable evidence I could find, I've estimated that psychiatric drugs are the third leading cause of death. We should never forget this. And people might wonder, how can depression pills kill a lot of people? Well, they do, because they are often used by elderly people. And when, for example, they get depression pills, they might lose their balance, fall and break a hip, and then 1/5 will be dead within a year. This is just one of the harmful effects of depression pills in the elderly. Next slide. Worse still, perhaps, claims of therapeutic benefit of drugs and electroshock was often based on the course of the disease in a treated group with no control group, and claims of 80% efficacy abounded in the textbooks. Such dramatic effects ignores the spontaneous improvement. If before-after comparisons were reliable, then why bother to do randomized trials with a control group? This is horrible scientific dishonesty, in my view. Next slide. And perhaps the worst thing about psychiatry is that psychiatrists are allowed to enforce drugs on people that kill many of them. I cannot imagine anything more inhumane in our society. And I have done 2 studies showing what happens when a cohort of patients appeal forced treatment orders. And my 2 studies are the only ones in the entire world literature. Why has no one else bothered to study this huge violation of human rights? I just don't get it. So I assembled 30 consecutive patients from Denmark and 30 from Alaska. And we published these observations, the last one very recently as a preprint, as you can see at the bottom. And there were systematic violations of the patient's rights and safety in both countries. Next slide. In Denmark, we assessed these 30 consecutive cases first on the web page, where some data had been posted anonymously from the Psychiatric Appeals Board. There was no clear and convincing evidence in any case that the proposed treatment was in the patient's best interest. According to Danish law, forced medication should be with drugs with the fewest possible adverse effects. This rule was violated in 29 of the 30 cases. The board mainly had a cosmetic function, rubber stamping what the psychiatrists wanted. It focused on uncontroversial issues it could easily check. Next slide. Then we actually got access to paper files, not everything, but enough to draw conclusions. And in 21 cases with information about the effect of previous drugs, the psychiatrist stated they had had a good effect, whereas none of the patients shared this view. The harms of earlier or currently used psychosis pills did not play any role for the psychiatrist's decision-making. The legal requirements for using force to protect the patient's health were never met, and less intrusive treatments were never mentioned as options. Next slide. The power imbalance was extreme. The patients felt misunderstood and ignored. Their legal protection was a sham, and the harm done was immense. Benzodiazepines is a less intrusive treatment, and it works equally well for acute psychosis. It actually works better than psychosis pills. It was never mentioned as an option. Psychotherapy works. It doesn't kill people. It was never mentioned as an option. Only in one case was there any indication that a patient might have received psychotherapy. Continuous talks with a psychologist. 7 patients asked for a psychologist but didn't get one. Next slide. We had reservations about the psychiatrist's diagnosis of delusions in no less than 9 of the 30 cases. We discussed these cases with the psychiatrist. When a patient rejected olanzapine, this was called a persecutory delusion, even though it's absolutely rational to be afraid of olanzapine. I have estimated that this drug alone has killed over 200,000 people. And this was only up till 2007, I think. A patient who would rather go to jail than get drugs and who had become lethargic while receiving no less than 3 antipsychotics, which goes directly against all international guidelines, plus additional drugs, was said not to have experienced inappropriate side effects. This is simply impossible. Next slide. And the patients were afraid of dying. You can't blame them. In 5 cases, they expressed their fear directly in the paper files we had access to. The drugs kill you. Either I kill him or he kills me with his shitty medicine. My father died because of intoxication with psychiatric drugs. I don't want to die. This patient was in treatment with dangerous polypharmacy consisting of clozapine tablets, aripiprazole depot injections, and sertraline along with tizanidine, clonazepam, and promethazine as needed. And as I said, psychosis drugs double death. They do kill people. Next slide. In Alaska, it was very much the same. And in the USA, psychiatrists, with the full understanding and tacit permission of the judges, regularly lie in court to obtain involuntary commitment and forced medication orders. I had doubts that this could be true, but then I was invited to Alaska by a lawyer to be an expert witness, and I saw several cases and had to conclude that yes, the psychiatrists, they are lying in court. For example, they invent the idea that the patients are much more ill than they really are, and that there are no harms of the drugs, which is not correct. The forced medication order was granted in 27 of the 30 cohort cases. In 26 cases, in violation of previous Supreme Court rulings, which the lawyer I visited actually had achieved. The patient's desires, fears, wishes, and experiences were totally ignored, even when the patients were afraid that the drugs used for psychosis might kill them, or when they had experienced serious harms, such as tardive dyskinesia, which psychiatrists very often overlook. The ethical and legal imperative of offering a less intrusive treatment was ignored, just like in Denmark. Benzodiazepines were not offered at all. So I did this research with a psychiatrist. Next slide. Psychotherapy was not offered or even mentioned in 15 of the cases. The providers claimed it doesn't work, which is blatantly false. The legal procedures were a sham also in Alaska, and the patients were defenseless. The power imbalance and abuse were extreme. Several of the psychiatrists who argued for forced treatment obtained court orders for administering drugs and dosages that were outright dangerous. This was not difficult to see. Next slide. So this leads me to some conclusions. Biological psychiatry has not led to anything of use. And if you have a mental health issue, don't look up a psychiatrist. This is too dangerous and could cost you many years of your life if the drugs don't directly kill you. Patients who have escaped the tyranny of forced treatment, psychiatric polypharmacy, and electroshock, they call themselves psychiatric survivors. So they survived not because of the treatment, but despite the treatment. If you call yourself a cardiac survivor, you are grateful that the cardiologist helped you survive. In psychiatry, it's precisely the opposite. The United Nations Handicap Convention has said very clearly that forced medication must be abandoned in all countries in the world. Not a single country has abandoned forced medication. And most importantly, psychiatry as a medical specialty is so harmful that it should be disbanded. In healthcare, when an intervention is harmful, we would like to stop it. And there is absolutely no doubt that psychiatry does far more harm than good, because the psychiatry use psychiatric drugs without knowing how dangerous they are. They combine them and make them even more dangerous. And they generally don't even know how to taper off the drugs slowly. They do it too quickly. They do it in a linear fashion instead of in a hyperbolic fashion, whereby they cause withdrawal symptoms, which I call abstinence symptoms. And they can be depression and psychosis. And then they conclude, there you see, the drugs are needed. The patients deteriorate. But why do they deteriorate? Because I, the psychiatrist, caused a cold turkey. Psychiatry is a disaster. Thank you.